It was a frigid, gloomy, and stormy night. It was the kind of night when all you wanted to do was remain home, curl up in bed, and go to sleep. But Detective Thomas was unable to escape the storm. The local sheriff's office had called and requested his assistance with a case that was giving them trouble. Several killings had occurred in the small village of Ravenwood, and the police needed Thomas's expertise to help them identify the killer. With sheets of rain falling and the wind howling through the trees, the drive to Ravenwood was hazardous. Thomas had to squint to see the road ahead as Thomas's headlights barely broke through the darkness. As he considered what he was going to enter, a chill ran down his spine. Throughout his career as a detective, he had witnessed some horrifying things, but this case felt different in some way. The sheriff, a grizzled old-timer who appeared to have not slept in weeks, welcomed Thomas as he arrived in Ravenwood. Thomas received a briefing from the sheriff on the murders, which were all committed against young ladies in their own houses with bizarre symbols etched into their flesh. Although Thomas was accustomed to the macabre, the specifics of these killings gave him the creeps. Thomas was taken by the sheriff to the first crime site, a rundown house outside of town. The wind was still roaring, shaking the windows and sending leaves and branches skittering across the porch even though the rain had stopped. When Thomas entered, he was immediately overcome by the morbidly sweet smell of death. The young woman's body was on the floor of the living room, her eyes vacantly fixed on the ceiling. Thomas squatted down next to her and looked at the markings on her body. He had never seen anything like them before, but something about them felt familiar. Thomas immersed himself in the investigation over the following few days. He investigated the evidence, spoke with witnesses, and examined the symbols etched into the skin of the victims. But the more he discovered, the more it seemed like he was clinging to thin air. There were no witnesses, suspects, or obvious reasons for the killings. Every time Thomas strolled down the street, he could sense the unease among the residents of Ravenwood. After a long day of work, Thomas was driving back to his hotel when he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. He slammed on the brakes and scanned the pitch-black distance. He initially believed it to be a lighting illusion, but he later noticed it again. A figure lurking in the shadows. His heart was thumping as he exited his car and pulled out his revolver. It turned out to be a statue, a hideous, twisted object with horns and tentacles and eyes that appeared to follow him everywhere he went, until he drew closer. As the days passed, Thomas' obsession with the case grew stronger. He searched through the evidence constantly during his waking hours in an effort to find some hint that would help him identify the murderer. His vivid nightmares began to feature visions of the dead ladies and the deformed statue he had seen in the pitch black. He started to suspect that he was losing his sense of reality. Tom got a package in the mail one day. He had anticipated receiving the item, but it nonetheless gave him the chills. A little wooden box with elaborate carvings that matched the symbols discovered on the victims' bodies was inside. Thomas saw right away that this was the murderer's message. I know in a language he didn't identify was inside the box when he opened it, but he was aware of what it signified. He was being dared by the murderer to go look for him. Thomas could see that by accepting the challenge, he was giving the murderer exactly what he wanted. He prepared his belongings and left into the wilderness, following a trail of hints that took him farther and further into Ravenwood. Wild and harsh, with gnarled trees and sheer cliffs that seemed to continue on forever, was the landscape. Thomas continued still, propelled by a great determination to apprehend the murderer before he could strike once more. After what seemed like hours of hiking, Thomas at last came to a clearing. A little cabin with smoke rising from the chimney stood in the middle of the clearing. Thomas approached with caution while pointing his revolver. But as he neared, he observed that the cabin was deserted. He went right into the trap the murderer had set for him. Tom looked around the cabin for any indication of the murderer. However, all he discovered was a message that was written in the same language as the letter he had previously gotten in the mail. Nevertheless, this time he had a translation. The message said, "You were mistaken in your belief that you could catch me. I always have the upper hand. You are now going to be my next victim." As Thomas read the note, his blood grew chilly. He discovered too late that he had fallen victim to a trap and was now at the killer's mercy. The door to the cabin was jammed when he attempted to exit. With all his power, he banged on it, but it remained stationary. He then heard the sound of footsteps coming toward the cabin. Thomas prepared himself while keeping his revolver ready. But when the door finally opened, he saw that nobody was inside. There was only the twisted statue, its eyes blazing in the shadows as it stood in the doorway. Thomas understood at that point that he was facing something considerably more sinister than a simple human killer. He attempted to flee, but the cabin was encircled by a thick forest, and he soon became lost. The twisted statue seems to follow him wherever he went as the wind howled through the trees. Thomas started to think he was going crazy. After several hours, Thomas came across an area that he was familiar with from before. He lost consciousness and fell on the ground, exhausted. He was aware that he would perish in this location alone and in fear, exactly like the victims of the assailant he had been pursuing. He then noticed a man emerging from the shadows with a menacing-looking blade. As Thomas' arms felt like lead, he attempted to lift his rifle. Thomas initially caught a glimpse of the face of the apparition as it loomed above him. It was the twisted statue's face coming to life, its eyes blazing with ethereal light. Thomas closed his eyes and prepared himself for what was going to happen. Nevertheless, when he opened them once more, he discovered that the clearing was vanished. He had returned to his hotel room and was secure. Confounded, he cast a confused glance in all directions, doubting that nothing was real. The note, the wooden box, and the symbols etched into his flesh were all then shown to him. The moment Thomas recognized this, the murderer had in fact found him. He had been duped into falling into a trap, and he had bought into it wholeheartedly. He was wounded and damaged as he lay there, but he also understood that he had accomplished something that no one else had been able to. He had witnessed the murderer's face and was still alive.